It was April 14th, 1981, and Carl Brenneman was 36 years old when he made a decision that looked like sentiment and felt like stubbornness and turned out to be neither. He was standing in the machinery shed on his father's farm outside Kelowna, Iowa, looking at a 1964 New Holland 68 hay baler that hadn't run in 3 years. The paint was faded but intact. The twine arms were rusted at the joints. The plunger still moved when you rocked the flywheel by hand, but barely. His father had died 8 months earlier in August, and Carl had inherited 214 acres, a hog operation that was bleeding money, and a collection of equipment that ranged from practical to obsolete. The New Holland 68 was obsolete. Carl had already bought a newer baler the previous summer, a used New Holland 315 with a Wisconsin engine and a kicker that could throw bales onto a wagon without a crew. He'd financed it through the dealer in Washington, Iowa, and it had performed well enough during the 1980 season to justify the note. The old 68 served no purpose anymore. It took up space in a shed that was already crowded. It had value, but only as scrap or as a trade-in toward something he didn't need yet. His wife, Linda, had asked him twice that spring what he planned to do with it. His brother-in-law had offered $300 for it, no questions asked. A neighbor down the road said he'd haul it away for free if Carl wanted it gone. The New Holland dealer in Washington said they'd give him $200 in trade credit, maybe $250 if the hydraulics still worked. Carl said no to all of them. He didn't say no because he had a plan. He said no because he didn't have a reason to say yes. The baler had been his father's first major purchase after taking over the farm in 1964, the year Carl turned 19. His father had used it for 17 seasons. It had baled every acre of hay Carl had ever handled as a young man. It had broken down more times than Carl could count, and his father had repaired it every time, usually with parts ordered through the mail and installed in the dim light of the machine shed after supper. Carl told Linda he'd think about it. Then he had the 68 towed to the back corner of the shed and covered it with a canvas tarp his father had used for grain. He paid a carpenter to build a simple partition wall out of 2x4s and plywood, creating a separate space where the baler could sit without being in the way. The wall cost him $47. He told himself it was temporary. It stayed that way for 23 years. Carl Brenneman had grown up understanding that farming was not about winning. It was about not losing long enough to pass something on. His father had taught him that, not with words, but with decisions. Decisions like buying used equipment and rebuilding it. Decisions like keeping hogs even when the margins disappeared. Decisions like refusing to expand when neighbors doubled their acreage and tripled their debt. His father had survived the farm crisis of the 1950s by staying small. He'd survived the consolidation wave of the 1970s the same way. When he died in 1980, the farm was paid off. The equipment was old but functional. The land was his. Carl inherited all of it free and clear, and he understood that the inheritance was not wealth. It was responsibility. The early 1980s were not kind to that responsibility. Grain prices fell. Interest rates climbed into the teens. The federal government tightened credit, and banks that had been eager to lend in the 1970s were suddenly eager to foreclose. Carl's hog operation, which had been marginal under his father, became unsustainable under him. By 1983, he'd sold the herd and converted the confinement building into storage. He kept the farm going with hay, corn, and soybeans, rotating crops on land that had been in his family since 1921. He did not buy new equipment. The New Holland 315 baler he'd purchased in 1980 was the last financed piece of machinery he brought onto the farm for nearly a decade. Everything else he acquired used, at auctions, from neighbors who were selling out. He bought a Ford tractor in 1984 for $1,800. He bought a disc harrow in 1986 for $300. He bought a grain auger in 1987 for $225. None of it was pretty. All of it worked. The machinery shed where the old New Holland 68 sat became a kind of museum, though Carl never thought of it that way. He stored things there that he wasn't using but wasn't ready to sell. a corn planter his father had used in the 1960s, a hay rake with wooden teeth, a manure spreader that hadn't been pulled in 15 years, and behind the partition wall, under the tarp, the '68 baler. Linda asked him about it once every few years. She never pushed. She understood that Carl had inherited more than a farm. He'd inherited a way of thinking, and that way of thinking did not include letting go of things that still had shape. The property taxes on the machinery shed were $64 a year in 1981. By 1990, they'd risen to $92. Carl paid them without complaint. The shed was part of the farm, and the farm was what he was keeping. In 1989, Carl's son, Nathan, turned 16. He was the youngest of 3 children and the only one who'd shown any interest in the operation. His older brother had gone to college in Cedar Falls and wasn't coming back. His sister had married a man from Muscatine and moved away in 1987. Nathan was quieter than both of them and more careful. He helped Carl with field work after school and on weekends. He learned to drive the tractor before he learned to drive a car. He didn't ask questions about the future, but Carl could see him watching, learning, measuring what the farm required. Carl didn't talk to Nathan about taking over. He didn't talk to him about legacy or inheritance or what it meant to be the last one willing. He just let Nathan work beside him and trusted that the work itself would teach him what words couldn't. But Carl also knew that the farm, as it was, could not support 2 families. It couldn't even reliably support one. If Nathan stayed, something would have to change. And Carl didn't know what that change could be without risking everything his father had protected. The 1990s brought modest improvement. Grain prices stabilized. Carl paid off the last of his operating loans in 1993. He bought a used New Holland combine in 1995, his first significant purchase in 15 years, and financed it over 3 years at a rate that didn't scare him. The farm was not growing, but it was not shrinking either. It was holding. Nathan graduated high school in 1991 and stayed. He worked full-time on the farm that summer, then enrolled part-time at Kirkwood Community College in Iowa City, taking agriculture business classes 2 evenings a week. He didn't talk about what he was planning. He just kept showing up. By 1998, Nathan was 25 and still on the farm. He was working land that couldn't pay him what he was worth, and Carl knew it. They'd had one conversation about it, in the fall of 1997, after a harvest that had been good enough to break even but not good enough to build anything. Nathan had said he wasn't leaving. Carl had said he didn't know how to make it work for both of them. Nathan had said he'd figure something out. The conversation ended there. Carl thought about that conversation often over the next few years. He thought about it when he saw neighbors selling out. He thought about it when he drove past farms that had been subdivided into 5-acre parcels with new houses and paved driveways. He thought about it when he paid property taxes that kept rising while commodity prices stayed flat. He did not think about the New Holland '68 baler sitting behind a plywood wall in the machinery shed. That was just something that was there, like the corn planter and the hay rake and all the other things he wasn't using but wasn't selling. In 2003, Nathan started talking about horses. Not about owning them, about the people who did. He'd noticed something that Carl hadn't, which was that the area around Kelowna had started changing. Families from Iowa City and Cedar Rapids were buying small acreages in the country. 5 acres, 10 acres, 20. They weren't farming. They were keeping horses, horses for recreation, horses for their daughters, horses that needed hay. And the hay they needed wasn't the big round bales that Carl and most farmers had switched to in the 1980s. It was small square bales, 45 to 60 pounds each, easy to handle, easy to store, easy to feed 1 or 2 animals at a time. There was a market for it, Nathan said, a growing one, and nobody local was serving it well. Nathan had done research. He'd talked to feed stores. He'd talked to a man in Washington County who was baling small squares custom for horse owners and charging a premium. He'd priced out used equipment. He thought he could start a small custom baling business on the side, baling for hobby farms and small horse operations within a 20-mile radius. It wouldn't replace farm income, but it might supplement it. It might be a way to stay. Carl listened. He didn't discourage him. But he also didn't know how Nathan would finance it. A good small square baler, even a used one, cost money. A truck to haul bales cost money. Twine, fuel, maintenance, insurance, it all added up. And Nathan didn't have savings. The farm didn't generate savings. Nathan said he'd figure it out. Carl believed him, but belief didn't solve the problem. It was early March 2004 when the man from Fairfield called. Carl didn't know him. The man said his name was Roger Thiessen and that he collected antique farm equipment, mostly New Holland, mostly from the 1960s and 70s. He'd heard through a contact at an estate auction in Henry County that Carl Brenneman in Kelowna might have a 1964 New Holland 68 baler. And if that was true, and if Carl was interested in selling, Roger would like to come take a look. Carl said he'd have to think about it. Roger said he understood, but that he'd driven down from Fairfield and would appreciate 5 minutes just to see it, even if Carl wasn't selling. Carl agreed. They met that Saturday. Roger pulled up in a Dodge pickup with a tilt-bed trailer. He was in his early 60s, wearing Carhartt overalls and a seed corn cap. He shook Carl's hand and followed him into the machinery shed without small talk. Carl pulled back the tarp. The baler was covered in dust, but the sheet metal was intact. The paint had faded to a pale blue-green, but there was no significant rust. The twine arms were seized, but Roger said that was normal. He rocked the flywheel. He inspected the plunger. He crouched down and looked at the frame rails. He spent 20 minutes going over it without saying much. Then he stood up and said it was one of the cleanest 68s he'd seen in years. Carl asked what that meant. Roger said it meant the baler had value, not as a working machine, but as a collector's piece. The New Holland 68 had been one of the most popular small square balers of its era, and the 1964 models were particularly sought after by people who restored antique equipment. A baler in this condition, complete and restorable, could sell for $1,500 to $2,000 to the right buyer, maybe more if it was restored. Carl said he hadn't known that. Roger said most people didn't. He asked if Carl would consider selling it. Carl said he wasn't sure. Roger said he'd pay $1,700 for it as it sat, and he'd pick it up that week. Carl told him he'd think about it. Roger left his phone number. Carl put it in his wallet and didn't look at it for 3 days. That Wednesday evening, Carl and Nathan were sitting at the kitchen table after supper. Linda had gone to a church meeting. It was just the two of them, and the conversation turned, as it often did, to Nathan's idea about custom baling. Nathan had been pricing equipment again. A decent used small square baler was running between $2,000 and $3,000, depending on condition. A newer one was $5,000 or more. He'd found a 1990 New Holland 316 baler for sale near Williamsburg for $2,200, and the seller said it had been maintained well and still tied consistent bales. Nathan thought it was a fair price. He just didn't have $2,200. Carl had been thinking about Roger Thiessen's offer. He hadn't mentioned it to Nathan yet. He didn't know why. Maybe because it felt like selling something that wasn't entirely his to sell. Maybe because he didn't want to admit that a baler he'd been storing for 23 years was worth more now than when he'd put it away. But sitting there, listening to Nathan talk about financing and startup costs, trying to make something work on a farm that had never had margin for new ideas, Carl realized what the old baler actually was. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't stubbornness. It was capital that had been sitting still long enough to become something else. He told Nathan about Roger Thiessen. He told him about the $1,700 offer. He told him he'd been keeping the 68 in the shed since 1981, behind a partition wall, under a tarp, because he hadn't known what else to do with it. Nathan didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked if Carl was serious. Carl said he was. Nathan said that if Carl sold the baler, and if Nathan could find another $500 or $600 somewhere, he could buy the 316 in Williamsburg and have enough left over for twine and repairs and maybe a used hay rack. Carl said that sounded right. Nathan asked why Carl had kept it all those years. Carl didn't have an answer that made sense in words. He said he wasn't sure. He said maybe his father had taught him to hold on to things, and he'd just never learned when to let go. Or maybe he'd learned exactly when, and this was it. They called Roger Thiessen that night. Roger came back on Saturday with cash. He loaded the New Holland 68 onto his trailer, shook Carl's hand, and drove away. Carl stood in the empty space behind the partition wall and felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't loss. It wasn't relief. It was just the strange weight of realizing that a thing you'd kept without knowing why had turned out to matter after all. Nathan bought the 1990 New Holland 316 baler the following week for $2,100. He paid for it with the $1,700 from the 68 sale and $400 he'd saved from part-time work over the winter. He spent the next month reconditioning it, replacing belts and bearings, adjusting the knotters, testing it in the yard with scrap hay until the bales came out tight and square. He started taking custom baling jobs that May, small operations, horse farms, hobby acreages, people who needed 200 bales, not 2,000. He charged by the bale and by the mile. He worked evenings and weekends after the regular farm work was done. It wasn't much at first, a few $100s a month, but it was something that hadn't been there before. By the end of the first season, Nathan had baled for 11 different customers. Some of them were one-time jobs. 4 of them became regulars. One of them, a woman who kept rescue horses on 40 acres near Riverside, told Nathan she'd been looking for someone reliable for 3 years and asked if he'd be willing to contract for the whole season next year. Nathan said yes. The business grew slowly. Nathan didn't advertise. He relied on word of mouth and repeat customers. By 2006, he was baling for 19 regular clients and pulling in enough income to cover his living expenses and take pressure off the farm. By 2008, he'd bought a second baler, a newer New Holland BC 5060, and hired a high school kid to help load wagons during peak season. Carl watched it happen without interference. He didn't give advice. He didn't manage the operation. He just kept the farm running the way it had always run, and let Nathan build something alongside it that was his own. In 2010, Nathan married a woman named Emily who worked as a veterinary technician in Iowa City. They moved into a house on the edge of the farm property, a small place Carl and Linda had rented out for years. Nathan kept the custom baling business going. Emily started picking up clients through her vet connections, people with horses who needed hay and didn't know where to get it. The business expanded again. Carl was 65 that year. He started stepping back, not retiring, but stepping back. Nathan took over more of the day-to-day field work. The custom baling operation was generating enough income that Nathan could afford to hire seasonal labor during harvest. The farm, for the first time in Carl's memory, had 2 sources of revenue. Neither one was large, but together they were enough. Linda asked Carl once, in the fall of 2011, if he'd known what the old baler would become. Carl said no. He said he'd kept it because letting it go felt wrong, and keeping it felt like the only choice that didn't require him to explain himself. He said he'd paid property tax on that machinery shed for 23 years, $90-some a year, and he'd never once regretted it. Not because he knew it would pay off, but because he'd learned from his father that the things you keep for no clear reason sometimes turn out to have the clearest reasons of all. By 2015, Nathan's custom baling business was serving 37 regular clients across 3 counties. He'd purchased a 3rd baler and a used stake bed truck. He employed 2 part-time workers during summer. The business had a name, Brenneman Hay Service, and a reputation for reliability that kept the phone ringing from April through September. The farm itself had not grown. It was still 214 acres, the same size it had been when Carl's grandfather bought it in 1921. But it was still there, still operating, still in the family. And Nathan's 2 sons, born in 2011 and 2013, were growing up the same way Nathan had, watching their father work, learning what the land required, understanding that staying was a choice you made every year. Carl Brenneman turned 70 in 2015. He still drove tractor during planting and harvest, but most of the work had shifted to Nathan. The custom baling business that had started with $1,700 from a 1964 New Holland 68 was now generating more annual income than the row crop operation. Nathan had paid off all his equipment. He owned his balers outright. He had clients who'd been with him for 10 years. The old machinery shed was still standing. The partition wall Carl had built in 1981 was still there, though the space behind it was empty now. Carl walked through it sometimes, late in the evening, when the work was done and the farm was quiet. He'd stand in that empty corner and think about the baler that had sat there for 23 years, covered by a tarp, gathering dust, taking up space, costing him $90 a year in property tax. He thought about all the times he could have sold it, all the times people had asked, all the times Linda had suggested it might be time to let go. He thought about Roger Thiessen, who'd driven down from Fairfield looking for antique equipment and had handed him $1,700 in cash for a machine Carl's father had bought for $1,100 in 1964 and that Carl had put away in 1981. He thought about Nathan, standing in the kitchen in 2004, trying to figure out how to finance a future on a farm that didn't generate futures. And he thought about his father, who'd taught him to hold on to things not because they had value, but because you didn't always know when value would arrive. The years after 2015 brought changes that Carl had stopped trying to predict. Nathan's custom baling operation continued to grow, but not recklessly. He added a fourth baler in 2017, but only because 3 of his longtime clients had expanded their horse operations and needed guaranteed capacity during tight weather windows. He didn't chase growth, he managed it. In 2018, one of Nathan's largest clients, a therapeutic riding center near Solon, offered to buy hay directly from the Brenneman farm on contract. They needed consistent quality and a reliable supplier. Nathan worked out the details with Carl, and they converted 30 acres from corn and soybeans back to alfalfa and Timothy mix. It was the first time in 40 years the farm had grown hay specifically for sale rather than for livestock feed. The contract paid better than grain, not by much, but enough to matter. And it created a closed loop that made sense in a way Carl recognized. They were growing hay on land that had always grown hay. They were baling it with equipment that carried the same name his father had trusted. They were selling it to people who needed it, not speculating on commodity markets they couldn't control. Carl turned 73 that year. His knees were going. His hearing was mostly gone in his left ear, but he still walked the fields in early morning and late evening, checking fence lines and drainage ditches and the things that didn't change just because you got old. In the spring of 2019, Emily Brenneman started keeping books for the baling business. She'd taken an accounting course online and realized that Nathan had been tracking income and expenses on paper in a way that worked but wasn't efficient. She set up a simple software system, started invoicing clients electronically, and discovered that the business had been undercharging for mileage and overtime for years. She raised rates modestly. None of the clients complained. 2 of them said they'd been expecting it. By the end of that season, the business had cleared an additional $4,000 simply by charging what the work was actually worth. Nathan told Carl about it one evening in October after they'd finished combining the last field of soybeans. He said Emily had probably saved the business from slowly pricing itself out of existence. Carl said that sounded like something Linda would have done 30 years ago if he'd let her near the books. They both understood what that meant. The farm had survived as long as it had, not just because of the decisions men made in the field, but because of the decisions women made at the kitchen table. By 2020, the custom baling operation was grossing $48,000 a year. The row crop operation was grossing $32,000. The farm, for the first time in its history, was generating income from 2 distinct enterprises, and the newer one was outperforming the traditional one. Nathan was 47. His older son, Jacob, was 9 and already asking to ride along on baling jobs. His younger son, Matthew, was 7 and more interested in the machinery than the work, which Carl recognized as a different kind of promise. Carl was 75. He'd officially retired from field work in 2019, though he still consulted on planting dates and seed varieties and drainage issues. He spent most of his time in the machine shed now, organizing tools, maintaining equipment, and doing the small repairs that didn't require a mechanic. The partition wall he'd built in 1981 was still standing, though the wood had grayed and the plywood had warped in places. Carl had thought about tearing it down several times over the years. It served no purpose anymore. But he never did. It had become part of the structure, the way decisions do when enough time passes. In the fall of 2021, a reporter from the Iowa Farm Bureau magazine came to the farm to do a story about multi-generational operations that had adapted to changing markets. Nathan had been reluctant to participate, but Emily convinced him it might be good for the business. The reporter asked Nathan how he'd gotten started in custom baling. Nathan told him about the 1990 New Holland 316 he'd bought in 2004. The reporter asked how he'd financed it. Nathan paused, then looked at Carl, who was sitting on a workbench in the corner of the shed. Carl told the story. The 1964 New Holland 68, the 23 years in storage, the partition wall, the property taxes, Roger Thiessen from Fairfield, the $1,700 that became Nathan's startup capital. The reporter asked Carl why he'd kept the baler all those years. Carl said he didn't know. He said he'd been asked that question many times, and he'd never had a good answer. He said maybe it was because his father had taught him that the value of a thing wasn't always apparent when you were looking at it. Sometimes it only became clear when someone else needed it. The reporter wrote that down. The article ran in the January 2022 issue. It was 3 pages long, with photographs of Nathan and his sons standing next to a New Holland baler in front of the machine shed. Carl and Linda were in one photo, standing in the background near the partition wall. The caption identified them as the previous generation, still present, still watching. 3 people called the farm after the article came out. 2 of them were reporters wanting similar stories. One of them was a man from Marion who said he'd kept his father's 1967 New Holland haybine for 18 years and had always felt foolish about it until he read Carl's story. He didn't have a question. He just wanted Carl to know. Carl thanked him and said he understood. In 2023, Nathan bought his 5th baler, a New Holland BC 50U70. It was the first brand new piece of equipment the Brenneman farm had purchased in 43 years. Nathan financed it through the New Holland dealer in Washington, the same dealership Carl's father had used in 1964, though the building had changed and the people were different. The monthly payment was manageable. The business could support it. Nathan didn't ask Carl for approval, but he told him about it after the paperwork was signed. Carl asked him if it felt different, buying new. Nathan said it did. He said it felt like trust that the work would continue, trust that the income would hold, trust that the equipment would last long enough to justify the investment. Carl said that sounded right. By early 2024, Carl Brenneman was 79 years old. He walked slower. He forgot names more often, but his memory of the farm, of the years and the seasons and the decisions that had shaped them, remained clear. He thought often about the New Holland 68 baler, not with regret or nostalgia, but with a kind of quiet recognition. He'd kept that machine for 23 years without knowing what it was for. He'd built a wall around it. He'd paid taxes on the space it occupied. He'd said no to people who wanted to take it away. And when the moment came, when Nathan needed something Carl didn't have, the baler had been there. Not because Carl had planned it, but because he hadn't been in a hurry to let it go. The farm had remembered what he'd forgotten, that some things are worth keeping not because you know why, but because you don't know why yet. That capital isn't always money. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's the refusal to make a decision before the decision is required. Carl Brenneman had kept a 1964 New Holland 68 hay baler in a machine shed from 1981 to 2004. 23 years. He'd paid approximately $2,000 in property taxes on that building during that time. He'd turned down offers to sell it. He'd built a partition wall to keep it separate and safe. In 2004, he'd sold it for $1,700 to a man who restored antique equipment. That $1,700 became the seed capital for his son's custom baling business. That business, over the next 20 years, grew into an enterprise that generated more income than the traditional row crop operation. That income allowed Nathan to stay on the farm. It allowed him to raise his sons there. It allowed the land to remain in the family. The numbers didn't balance in any conventional sense. Carl had spent more on storage and taxes than he'd received in sale price. But the value wasn't in the transaction. It was in what the transaction made possible. Nathan's custom baling business wasn't built on the baler. It was built on the idea that keeping something when you don't know why is sometimes the most rational choice you can make. Carl sat in the machine shed in the spring of 2024, 79 years old, watching his grandson Jacob help Nathan load a wagon with square bales. The boy was 12 now, strong enough to handle the work, careful enough to be trusted with it. The partition wall was still standing. The space behind it was still empty. Carl had never torn it down. He'd thought about it, but something had always stopped him. Maybe it was the same instinct that had made him build it in the first place. The sense that some structures are worth maintaining even after their original purpose is gone. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe the wall was just a reminder that the things you keep, the things you protect, the things you refuse to explain or justify or sell, sometimes turn out to be the things that matter most. Carl Brenneman had kept a baler for 23 years for no reason he could articulate. And in the end, the farm had remembered what he'd forgotten. That sometimes the thing you keep becomes the thing that keeps you.